So hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the third lecture of the Society for Experimental Biology 2022 Christmas Lecture Series. If you have joined us before for other Christmas lecture, welcome again. And for those who doesn't know us, we are a society for scientists who research plant, animal, and cell biology. So my name is Anna, I'm the Outreach and Engagement Officer. So it's a pleasure to welcome you to the third lecture of our series entitled The Christmas Bird Count, From Historical Conservation to 21st Century Community Science, that will be presented by Geoffrey LeBaron. Jeff is the Christmas Bird Count Director for the National Audubon Society, a position held since 1987. Jeff also works on other community science projects within the society, including Climate Watch and the Great Backyard Bird Count, as well as ornithological and birding advisor on projects from the conservation science team. Other tasks at Audubon have included consultant for natural history accuracy for Audubon Productions and the communications and content teams for both the Audubon website and magazine, advisor for projects under development by the marketing team, leader for both leadership and staff birdathon fundraisers, consultant for special events, occasional lecturer, and frequent Audubon media spokesperson on various subjects. Jeff did his undergraduate degree in biology from the University of Miami in Florida and a master's degree in zoology from the University of Rhode Island. Jeff has tour leading experience in various countries, including Alaska, Galapagos Islands, South Africa, and New Zealand. Thank you so much for accepting this invitation, Jeff, and I'm handing over to you now.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Anna. Thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be here and to talk about the Christmas bird, to Audubon's Christmas bird count to what may be a relatively new audience. I'll get going with the program here, and then you won't have to look at me. So hopefully everybody is seeing the screen in full screen mode. The Christmas bird count is a really fascinating program. It's one of the earliest and longest running citizen science or community science efforts that is out there in the world. Especially in North America, it's one of the oldest ones. There are some other older ones in the UK in terms of nest box studies and things like that. But in terms of data that are actually collected in the long term and over the entire continent, and now increasingly into the Americas, to Central and South America, the CBC is really one. It's about the only thing that's available that has become available for people to actually help understand what's happening with the birds across the Americas. It all began in the late 1800s. There was a growing need for a growing awareness for the need of conservation rather than consumption of wildlife. There had been, it was a feather hat, the millinery trade and the use of parts or whole birds in fashion, ladies' fashion especially, was decimating, especially colonial nesting water birds like egrets and herons and spoonbills and things like that over much of North America. And people, what started as what was just called the Audubon movement. It was independent Audubon societies were begun throughout many of the states, especially in the Northeast in the late 1800s. And eventually this evolved into the National Audubon Society, which is the organization that I work for. But the millinery trade was causing just catastrophic declines in the numbers of birds that were out there. And many of these species were on the verge of extinction. A gentleman named Frank Chapman, who was a bird curator at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and also a widely traveled ornithologist, fortunately had his own publication called Bird Lore, And what he decided to do is he decided there had been a tradition called the side hunt where people would choose sides and go out and hunt to bring in probably fare for the holiday dinner. What Dr. Chapman or Mr. Chapman decided to do was to actually encourage people to go out and do a Christmas bird census rather than a Christmas bird hunt. He published the idea in his magazine in Bird Lore in 1900, and that year on Christmas Day of 1900, the Christmas bird count or CBC was begun. The first year there were 25 different locations that were covered and 27 total people. And it's literally been done every year since then. Some areas have been done every single year since 1900, including Central Park in New York City. It's grown tremendously, as we'll talk about in a minute, and it's really kind of a fascinating snapshot, and not only the history of conservation in the United States, but also just what's happening with the birds across the Americas. It's fun because birders generally have fun, unless you didn't find the bird that you most wanted to see for the day. It has become very social. It's become a real tradition for people who met a lot of people once they start doing Christmas bird counts, like myself. I started doing CBCs when I was in graduate school, quite a while before I actually ever got this job. It really becomes a sense of the social and traditional aspects of it are extremely important, and they are basically what keeps it running and what makes it so successful. It's educational in that we welcome bird lovers and bird watchers of any skill level and ability, because you don't have to know all the birds to go out on a Christmas bird count, because you will never be actually, if you're a new person to birding, you won't be in the field alone. You'll be with experienced birders who know both the birds and the area. So therefore, it's a wonderful educational experience for both new birders of really any age. And what's become true is it's incredibly scientifically valuable. The first year that in 1900, there were counts done both in the United States from the East Coast to the West Coast and in Southern Canada. But it's grown a lot since then. Until 1972, we only included CBC results from the US and Canada, but after that season, in the 73rd Christmas bird count, which would have been December of 1972, we started accepting counts from outside the US, from within the West, mostly in the Western Hemisphere, throughout the Americas. And that very first year, we had counts in Mexico and also in Puerto Rico and in Panama very shortly. And now it's grown tremendously to include many counts in Central America, quite a few counts, a lot of counts in Colombia. We have counts throughout the Caribbean, and we also do include counts in the South Pacific Islands. What we're looking at in terms of the birds is birds that spend a significant portion of their life cycle in North America. And the reason we include, Tinian, Rhoda, Guam, and Saipan down in the South Pacific is because many of the shorebirds that breed in the Canadian and Alaskan Arctic go down to that area to winter. And maybe you just heard recently, the longest known nonstop migration for any bird was recently documented with a bar-tailed godwit, which is a big wader, sandpipery kind of a bird. They breed in northern Alaska and the Arctic Alaska, and this bird, a hatch-year bird, flew nonstop from Alaska to Tasmania in 11 days. It never stopped. It's the longest known nonstop migration of any bird so far. So as you can see, the Christmas bird count has grown a lot in terms of its coverage, as well as in number of counts and the number of people. This shows you the, I should turn that off, this is the map of the expected counts for this season, the 123rd count. The different colors of the circles on the map show whether or not the count is closed. If they may have a special access, so they can't welcome new birders, but the yellow and green circles are ones where new birders are welcome to contact the compiler of the count. Each count is organized and managed by an individual or a small group of compilers. They're the ones that are in charge. My boss, Frank Gill, at the time used to say I had the most challenging job at Audubon because I had 2,000 direct reports. People take a real sense of ownership over their counts, and they're very willing to tell me if they think I'm not doing things the right way. So as you can see, we have counts, really a lot of counts with really good coverage over most of all of the United States, so Southern Canada. Their counts run in every count and every province in Canada, and again throughout Latin America down into Northern South America. Oops, why is it not moving? There we go. The numbers of counts have grown tremendously. As I said, in the first year, there were 27 people on 25 counts. The most we had was in the 120th Christmas bird count just before COVID, when we had nearly 82,000 observers and over 2,600, almost 2,650 different areas that were covered. It was just this, and then, like I said, I figured at one point that that's roughly 5% of the land mass of the United States and Southern Canada that is covered within Christmas bird count areas. Numbers have dropped slightly because of COVID, because we had to run, we were afraid we wouldn't be able to run the Christmas bird count for the 121st count, the first full year of COVID. But we developed guidelines for running a COVID safe count, which really cut back on the social aspect of the Christmas bird count because people were unable to gather for their compilation gatherings or meet for lunch or breakfast. And we had to do social distancing during the count. But it still worked. We still had, a good number of counts, and the numbers have grown nearly back up to that pre-COVID level as of this past season, the 122nd count. Interestingly, as I mentioned, people get really involved and sort of dedicated to doing their Christmas bird counts. I still try to go down to Rhode Island to do my 2 CBCs every season from in Western Massachusetts. Through the 116th count, we could measure the entire span of the CBC in the involvement of 2 people. Frank Chapman, who started it in 1900 and who retired in 1934, and Shan Robbins started compiling and participating as a young, teenager in 1934, and he compiled for almost his entire lifetime and participated until the year he died in 2016. So we had 116 years of the direct involvement of 2 people in a CBC. That's a bit, more than average, but it shows you that people really do become dedicated to doing their survey. Chan was a wonderful person. He's the one who started the Breeding Bird Survey here in North America. And he was on the advisory committee. He actually had my job as director of the Christmas bird count for a while. And he was just a wonderful, wonderful person. As of last season, the 122nd count, we had 76,880 observers. Like I said, had grown to nearly 82,000 in 2020. We had 2,621 counts done last season that were submitted. Over 42 million birds of 2,554 species across the Americas. About 600 of those are in the US and Canada. And then in terms of the number of species that people can find on a given count, the 2 highest areas, of course, are the southern coasts of North America. So the Mad Island Marsh, Texas count down along the Gulf Coast of Texas near Houston. They came in with 230 species last season, and we had one of the counts in Ecuador that had almost 400 species. We have had Christmas bird counts in Ecuador, especially that had over 500 species of birds on count day. Each Christmas bird count is done within a 15-mile diameter or 24-kilometer circle. So it's 7.5-mile radius. Generally, the way it's done, and it's a described, it's a very it's a fixed center point with this circle around it, and then everything within that circle, but nothing outside that circle is fair game to be covered during the day of a Christmas bird count. Each count is done on one calendar day between the dates of December 14th and January 5th. And most Christmas bird counts have enough attendees that the compilers actually can break their counts up into different areas or sectors. What they do is, they carefully manage their participants so that the we want to minimize double counting, because that messes up the data to have any people that are covering the same area and counting the same birds. So each group covers their area or areas, and when they're done, they don't count in any other part of the circle, and they submit their data back to the compiler. Either at the end of the day with a compilation gathering, or lately compilers have been doing Zoom compilations, or they just get people to submit their checklist to them via the internet. No birds seen outside the circle are fair game. The bird has to be within the circle on count day. And the critical thing, which is why the Christmas bird count is such an important database and why it's so meaningful, is we're not only collecting the species and the numbers of every species of birds, but we're also collecting the effort data. So we know how much effort, how many party hours and party miles were put into counting those birds. Because in theory, you have more people, they're going to count more birds in a given area, whether or not there are actually more birds there. And in the long run, what we're doing with the Christmas bird count is we're looking at trend data over time. So most researchers, when they're looking at Christmas bird count data, don't look at the raw numbers. They look at the effort weighted data, or what the birds per party hour. And the graphs that I'm going to be showing you today are all showing in birds per party hour. When I started in 1987, the Christmas bird count was a 100% paper program. I sent the same 16-page paper booklet out to every compiler everywhere. They filled their results into that booklet by hand. It had the printed list of all what we thought were expected species on any Christmas bird count in North America. They filled it all out by hand. They mailed it back to me. I had to hand edit every single form. Then we sent all the original forms to India for typesetting, for initial, getting the pages ready for typesetting. They came back to us. We had to proofread the raw printouts. Then it went off to the printer. We had to get page galleys back, reproof that, and then the end result was a 600 to 700 page book that showed all the results of every Christmas bird count that was submitted that season. It's a very different world now. In 2000, we actually created the online database and created the online data entry system, and now it's all online. We don't have a printed publication anymore. We have an electronic newsletter that goes out, and the results are basically viewable as soon as compilers enter them online. So this is the Christmas bird count website as it is right now, at least part of it. Currently the way the compilers, once they've compiled all their data from all their observers and group parties, they log in. It's login protected, and then what they're presented with is basically the data entry portal for their own Christmas bird count. Like I said, we are very careful to keep effort data. We need the number of people, the number of groups, and then all the hours and miles that they spent by various different methods. A subset of people on most Christmas bird counts just stay at home and watch their feeders. So we keep track of the number of people and hours that people are watching their feeders. So the compilers enter their effort section, and then they go to their bird checklist section. And what this is now is it's the historical record of all the species that have been seen specifically on that count. Not everyone everywhere, just the birds that have been reported on their count. And then they do have, of course, the ability to add something new, which is the excitement of almost every year on a Christmas bird count. You sort of hope that you're going to see something that hasn't been seen on the CBC before. So it's a far more accurate system to have the compilers doing their own data entry, reviewing their results as they're entering, and then we move on and start to do the kinds of analysis that we can do with the Christmas bird count. The CBC has become one of only 2 large-scale databases in North America to understand what's happening with the birds in North America. The other one is the Breeding Bird Survey that I mentioned Chan Robbins started in 1966. So when we look at trend data for the birds of the Americas, what we're looking at is the Christmas bird count combined with the Breeding Bird Survey, and then we want to see how the birds are doing over time in given region. And we also, with the Christmas bird count, we can tell if the species are changing their ranges. One of the early studies that was done on Christmas bird count results was in the 1980s on the American black duck. As I mentioned, the Christmas bird count was started as an alternative activity to overhunting. Well, it was duck hunters that actually noticed that American black ducks were declining quite a bit. And they reported this to Fish and Wildlife. The wintering range of the American black duck is very nicely covered by Christmas bird counts. So the feds actually analyzed the CBC data. You can tell that American black duck numbers have really gone down. So they actually altered bag limits for the American black duck based on the results that they were able to see in the Christmas bird count data set. We can also look at what's happening. And by the way, everything I'm showing you here is available, and you can sort of do your own inquiries through the Christmas bird count website, because all of it, as I said, the entire historical database is there online, and people can go and look at their favorite species or their favorite place or whatever, and just see how things are doing over time. We have the largest buteo or diurnal hawk in North America is the ferruginous hawk. And this is it's a real specialist on prairie dog towns it needs especially short grass prairie in the Western United States. What you can really track here is the effects of the banning of DDT after 1973. You start to see the numbers in the ferruginous hawks as reported on Christmas bird counts going way up, and then suddenly they start dropping again. This is when there was a kind of a transition over much of the West to more industrialized agriculture and also much more grazing land. And the people with cattle that graze cattle don't like prairie dog towns because the cattle can step into the prairie dog holes and actually break their legs. So there was a lot of control and elimination of the prairie dog towns during sort of the early 90s. And you can see the ferruginous hawk numbers started dropping again. That's become a little bit under control, so now things seem to have stabilized. So it's just interesting. You can sort of track the history of how birds are being affected by human activities when you look at the results of some of these. The other thing, like as I mentioned, Christmas bird count results are really good at documenting how birds are shifting their ranges over time. We have 2 grackles. You don't have grackles in the UK, but they're large, sort of blackbirdy kinds of birds. And there are 2 what we call the big grackles, boat-tailed and great-tailed grackles. And boat-tails are on the East Coast from Florida up to southern New England, and the great-tails formerly were just around the Gulf Coast in Texas. And looking at the Christmas bird count data from the different years, you can actually see over the decades how these grackles have moved northward. And it's really interesting to note that the boat-tailed grackles on the East Coast spread pretty quickly up to the mid-Atlantic and southern New England, and then they just stopped. They haven't really moved any farther. Whereas the great-tailed grackles in the West have dramatically expanded and are continuing to dramatically expand in that northwestern vector. And they're basically now seen up into British Columbia on some Christmas bird counts. So that's probably a result of is these birds are attracted to farmland, and with more the changing in farming practices, that's probably been a good thing for the great-tailed grackles, and that's what we're seeing here. Another bird that you can track and similar to several species, there were former well-known and formerly southeastern species that have really colonized much of especially eastern part of the continent winter by winter. These are non-migratory species, and this is the tufted titmouse is one of them, northern cardinals, another red-bellied woodpecker. And what you can do with the CBC is you can really track how tufted titmice have expanded their range northward over the last century. The red counts the red circles are CBCs that reported tufted titmouse, and the gray ones are counts that existed that season but didn't report titmice. And you can see that in the most recent years, they're actually up into Canada, when they in fact used to be primarily down in the southeastern US. This is probably due to two reasons. Warming early winter climate, temperatures and open water is enabling the birds to survive further and further north, but also the popularity of bird feeders. Tufted titmice are very prone to are very happy to come to anybody's bird feeder anywhere. And if you've got them around, they're wonderful additions to your backyard avifauna. We can also sort of track the fate of groups of birds. The grassland species globally are doing very poorly. It's one of the groups of birds worldwide that is doing very poorly. The eastern meadowlark is one of the sort of keystone species of the grassland areas in eastern North America. And you can see that this is typical of many of the grassland species in around the world, really. But for the ones on CBC, the numbers have declined dramatically, year after year after year. Again, it's the conversion of traditional farming with hedgerows and fallow fields over to more industrialized agriculture, where every inch of every field is covered with crop. And also the spread of suburbia, housing developments and shopping malls and such moving out into the more urban and suburban areas. So these are the things that are contributing, among the things that are contributing to the decline of grassland species. Now, I mentioned that there are two data sets that we can look at for understanding what's happening with birds in the Americas: the Christmas bird count in the winter and the breeding bird survey in the summer. The really nice thing is that when you look at the trend data for the species that are covered in both surveys, the trend data agree very nicely. So we have confidence that both the Christmas bird count and the breeding bird survey are showing us what's happening for the species that are surveyed by each one. The breeding bird survey, of course, gets a lot of the species that are the neotropical migrant ones, the ones that go to Central and South America for the winter, which for the most part are missed on Christmas bird counts in North America, which is where the vast majority of them are. These are all the warblers and tanagers and vireos and those kinds of things that all fly down these amazing migrations down into South America. But there are a lot of the breeding bird survey is a roadside route survey, so it has to be done where there are roads, and there's all the Canadian boreal forest and Arctic region north of where there's a road coverage in Canada and Alaska. Many of the birds that are missed because they breed up in those regions actually are found down in the core of North America during the Christmas bird count. So we get a nice a cross-section of extra species for both the breeding bird survey and the CBC, so it gives us a better full picture of what's happening across the continents. One of the boreal species that's a favorite of birders in the winter is the American tree sparrow. And this is a bird that breeds just really above tree line in the Arctic. They're shrubland species, but in the high Arctic. And they can be, if you go to Arctic regions in North America, you'll probably see tree sparrows in the summer. They move southward in the fall and in the winter, and oftentimes are formerly anyway encountered in big flocks. And you can see that tree sparrows, American tree sparrows, have really declined over the last 60 years. We're not really sure why, but it documents that something is happening with these, and we need to look at what that might be if it's something that can be addressed with conservation issues. Another one that is a favorite bird of many people here in North America in spring and fall is the white-throated sparrow. Their song is, people say it's "Oh Canada, Canada" if you're from Canada, or "Old Sam Peabody, Peabody." It's a very pretty, loud song, and they sing frequently in people's yards. It's a frequent yard bird for many people. White-throated sparrows have been declining a lot also. And again, the core of their breeding range is above where the breeding bird survey is, so that it's not sampled very well in the BBS. Whereas in the Christmas bird count, we are really looking at what's the core of where they are in the winter. Some birds are just totally missed by the breeding bird survey. This is the Harris's sparrow. It's a bird it breeds in sort of the south central Canadian Arctic areas up around Hudson Bay. But its wintering range is the core wintering range of this species is within what the Christmas bird count, where there are a lot of CBCs done and good coverage. So for the first time ever, we were starting to get a picture of what's happening with Harris's sparrows when we look at the data. And again, you can see, as with the tree sparrows, that these numbers of Arctic sparrows really are declining. Sort of the poster child for what's happening with boreal species is the rusty blackbird. It used to be counted in the millions in roosts in southeastern US, and those roosts don't happen anymore. We're not really sure exactly what's going on with this species, and because it's a boreal bog breeder. They breed in wet forested areas around bogs, and then they winter all down mostly in southeastern US. So it's very much up in the air what's happening with rusty blackbirds, but it's a species of severe conservation concern. And again, this is a species that's pretty much totally missed by the breeding bird survey. We did do a peer review of the Christmas bird count in 2003. We pulled together researchers and compilers and the editorial team and advisors for the Christmas bird count, and we brought them all together at Hawk Mountain Sanctuary in Pennsylvania for a 3-day powwow. Because Audubon and myself wanted to try to figure out were we doing things right? What maybe were we doing wrong, and what can we do to enhance the value of the data that we're collecting and are for analysis. We published those results in American Birds, which was the publication that used to be printed, and much to my pleasure, the review panel basically said, yeah, basically everything's going pretty well. There's a few little tweaks you can do. Try to get more of the historical data that aren't in there but basically keep doing what you're doing, and life will be good. When I started in 1987, ornithologists and researchers were very hesitant to utilize community science or citizen science data sets because they were afraid of all the wobble in there. I mean, scientists love to, as you know, account for every little bit of variability that they can in your analyses, so that if there's a change that you see in your results, it's due to something that's happening to the subject, not something else that you can't control for. And the idea of tens of thousands of unknown birders going out there all over the country, and who knows whether they're doing it the same way or whatever, that really gave pause to people to embrace the Christmas bird count and the breeding bird survey to some extent as good, valuable data sets for analyses. Actually, that black duck study that I mentioned was one of the very first ones that was done with CBC data, and what Audubon and the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center that manages the breeding bird survey, we published a series of papers that enable researchers to utilize community science and citizen science data sets, not just the CBC and BBS and birds, but any sort of community science data sets to enable them to do analyses on and account for in their analytical methods the variability of the things that can happen in these data sets for the Christmas bird count. Like I said, it's how do we know that the observers in Boston have the same skill set as the observers in St. Louis or Anchorage or Bogota, Colombia. And the point there is that they don't have to have the same skill set among counts, because it's always the same people in one given count that are doing it in the same way. So the results of any given Christmas bird count are very uniformly collected by pretty much the same people over time, so you still get really good trend data. The other thing in terms of the Christmas bird count that can greatly affect things is the weather. The weather not only during the count period, but also in the fall and even to some extent the summer preceding the Christmas bird count period, because we're looking at the very tail end of the fall migration. But when you look at Christmas bird count data in decade chunks, basically all of the possible weather effects, was it a snowstorm? Was it unusually warm? Was it foggy? Was it windy? All these things that can affect how easy it is to collect birds and the number of, not collect, to count birds, and the number of birds that are tallied, all comes out in the wash when you look at things by decade. So that's what we do. We look at the effort weighted data by decades for the Christmas bird count. And it's become a real industry. We get hundreds of inquiries from researchers around the world per year requesting CBC data, which we always are glad to supply them. As I mentioned, we can track not only the numbers of birds and the trend, but also where are the birds moving in responding to a changing climate. In 2006, we did the first study where we actually looked at birds that are well sampled in the Christmas bird count and looked at their, and because we're also collecting weather data or have weather data available, we can correlate what's happening with the birds and the weather. And many species have moved what we call their center of abundance, not the northern edge or south of range, but where would you go if you wanted to find the most of species X? And that center of abundance for many species has moved as much as 200 miles northward over the last 40 years. And again, temperatures have done the same. It's a warming trend. And as the early winter temperatures are warming, there's less snow cover further and further north and more open water further and further north. So that enables a lot of things to move northward. One of the birds is this boreal finch, the purple finch. The center of abundance of this species has moved almost 200 miles northward in the last 40 years. Not everything is moving northward. The common raven, which you guys have there too in the UK, its range, when you look at it over the same time frame, has actually moved quite a bit southward in the core of the range. This is a totally different scenario. This is a species that used to be persecuted, excuse me, and it no longer is. And also, the best thing we ever did for common ravens in North America anyway is we built cell phone towers because they love to nest on cell phone towers. And what's happened is common ravens have actually recolonized their traditional range in the southeastern US. So that's what we're seeing here. We can also look at birds that are very sensitive to cold winters that are non-migratory. The Carolina wren is one of these. And if I have 2 or 3 mild winters here in Western Massachusetts, we have Carolina wrens in our yard. They breed here, they're lovely, they're wonderful, they're interactive. If we get 2 hard winters in a row, bam, they're gone because they don't migrate. They don't know what migration is. And if they can't survive the winter, they wink out for a while. And what you can really see with Carolina wren graph in terms of north-south is you can track when the harsh winters were. That's where the big drops are. And things are trending upward again for Carolina wrens. Since we were able to document how birds have responded and shifted their ranges over time in a warming climate, what Audubon realized in 2012 is that we could actually do a study to do predictive modeling based on climate change scenarios, what was likely to happen to bird ranges in the future. It's all well and good to protect the areas that birds need right now, but if that's going to change in 50 or 70 years, you also need to think about what do we need to think about protecting for the future. And that's what the first climate study did. And these animated GIFs actually show you what's likely to be happening, where the yellow area is the predicted breeding range and the wintering area is the predicted wintering range. And outlined around them are where is the suitable habitat. And as you can see with burrowing owl, a lot of basically they're going to lose pretty much, they're likely to lose much of their breeding range by 2100. It's even worse for chestnut-collared longspur and many of these other species. These are short grass prairie specialists, and their anticipated environmental conditions that they need for successful breeding are going to pretty much disappear. We only looked at Christmas bird count data for the winter and breeding bird survey data for the summer in that first study. But there are a lot of, and it was basically just the birds and a few key climate indicators that we know they need for survival. What we did an updated version of the climate study, which came out in 2019. It basically includes a lot more things. It includes a lot more climate variables. It's much more detailed in terms of the fineness of scope. It looks at sea level rise, and it just brought in a whole bunch of other stuff. And the second, birds and climate change study, the survival by degrees, is really interesting because it shows, they're not the animated GIFs, but it shows you where the birds are likely to have to move based on the different climate change scenarios. But it also, if you type in a zip code, it will give you a list of the birds in your area and which ones seem like they're going to do okay, which ones are at risk, and which ones are likely to disappear. And also a list of things that you can potentially do to help that species in your area. Right on the CBC website, we have our trend viewer, which is fun because you can, go, if you've got your favorite species, you can choose it from the drop-down list. We've got right now 400 or 500 species that we've done the trend data, and this was updated through last year. We update it every 2 years. So you can see on a regional basis what's happening with species on the Christmas bird count. You can do it by continent, by survey-wide, by state, province, or also by bird conservation region, which is what this map is. And you can select which time frame you want and which type of trend data you want to look at. So and by the way, anything that you can look at on the Christmas bird count data on the Christmas bird count website, you can download to your computer. Audubon also has other citizen science programs that we run. The CBC is the largest and longest running one. We're involved also with the Great Backyard Bird Count that's done in February. It was actually, the GBBC was started as a test to see, when we were developing the online data entry system for the Christmas bird count, if people would come to a website just to submit data online. We knew people love to submit data and keep all their lists, but we were never sure if birders would welcome doing their online submissions. And the GBBC was designed to test whether or not birders would come, and they do. And in the long run, the development and the computerization of the 100-year data set for the Christmas bird count back in 2000, that enabled what is now called eBird. Audubon and the Laboratory of Ornithology got a big grant from NSF, a multi-year grant. We need the goal of what was then called Bird Source was to be able to track how birds are moving across the continents the way you can track the weather online. And we needed a core data set to start with. So that was when, for the first time ever, the entire Christmas bird count result set for the 100 years was available online. Prior to that, as I said, it was only available in print. The way we developed this database was we made Xerox copies of every single page of every single Christmas bird count issue and sent them to a gentleman named John Shipman in New Mexico, who was a friend of mine, and he was the most into CBC data of anybody I've ever known. He hand entered all 100 years worth of Christmas bird count data into the database and created the database, which became the core of Bird Source, which has evolved into what is now eBird. So we have the Christmas bird count. We're involved with the Great Backyard Bird Count, and we also have a new relatively new program called Climate Watch, which it's all well and good to make these predictive models of how we think species are going to be moving, but we wanted to test that. Were our models correct? So we chose certain species. We're asking for Climate Watch. What we do is we ask people to go out in areas where the birds are likely to be moving either into or leaving over the next 10 years. and as a select group of species. So that's what Climate Watch is about. As I mentioned, a lot of birds are doing well, a lot of birds are not doing well. One of the ones that's not doing well globally is the house sparrow, which of course is native in the UK and introduced all over the place. And it's one of the birds that birders love to hate. But it's an incredibly intelligent, widespread, adaptable species. But when you look at Christmas bird count results, it's actually declining over here as well as in Europe. Another one that birders love to hate here anyway is the starling. I think starlings are great because we had them when I was in graduate school. One of my co-students was, studying starling behavior, and they're really neat. They're very intelligent, but it's a common introduced species, so birders don't like them. But the starling numbers are really declining, almost as much as like the rusty blackbird numbers. And these are really of concern because birds tell us what the environment is like, and birds. It's the shared environment that we all have. And if things aren't going well with the birds, canary in the coal mine, it's likely that everything in those environments is not going to be doing well either. But as I said, it's not all bad news. There's a medium-sized falcon called the merlin, which is one of the coolest and scrappiest birds that I know. It's worldwide in the Northern Hemisphere. This is a bird that's doing gangbusters on Christmas bird counts. Their numbers are increasing dramatically. What merlins have done is they've adapted to nesting in urban environments. As long as there's a tree in the prairie provinces towns, there'll be a merlin's nest in that tree, and then they hunt all the field birds. And they never used to do that. It always used to be a bird of the boreal forests. So that's what's happening with merlins probably. They've adapted to human activities, and their numbers are increasing. So again, here's the map of the expected circles for CBC this season. And interestingly, of course, it corresponds, or not surprisingly, it corresponds to where the people are. We do need to get more counts. And one of the big pushes that we have right now is to try to get more counts in South America. But as you can see, the coverage of CBC is pretty much is similar to where all the people are in the Americas. And with that, I'll say thank you, and I'll hand it back over to Anna, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you for this informative and engaging lecture, Jeff. You have such an amazing database. It's impressive. And the community around the project, it's just amazing. But before we open for questions, we have a link for the feedback form in the chat. So if you have a spare minute to fill it out, we would really appreciate it. And we'll post the link again at the end of the Q&A. And then we'll now open for the questions. So feel free to type your question into the chat or raise your hand if you have any question. Let me check because I saw that there was a question already. Yeah, so the first one is, how do you feel community science apps like iNaturalist wait up to long-running organized citizen science programs like the CBC in terms of usable and useful data?
Well, for one thing, iNaturalist is not just birds. It's a great way of capturing data for many different groups of species worldwide. But I think these tools are excellent ways of gathering data and encouraging people to think about contributing data to data sets more than just about, oh, I saw a whatever. Now, not only did I see that, but I can tell people I saw it and all these other things. And that goes into a larger database, which becomes, potentially very, very valuable. In terms of the Christmas bird count itself and iNaturalist or whatever, or eBird for that matter, most of these types of apps and databases are single spot, single checklist kinds of data sets. The Christmas bird count is actually a pooled data set for all the checklists from within that 15-mile diameter circle. So it's a slightly different kind of their pool data. And for instance, the CBC database is not in eBird because eBird needs individual checklist data. There are plenty of people that submit their Christmas bird count checklist to eBird, but it isn't in the CBC database. That is all kept at Audubon because that's the way we manage it. So things like eBird and iNaturalist and those kinds of things can help contribute data. And what's happening more and more is there are new studies that are developed specifically to utilize those data sets that are being generated. So I think it's a great way. It's wonderful, and they're wonderful engagement tools.
Thank you. That's quite interesting. We have another question. Do you plan to expand initiatives like CBC on a global scale in the future, or do similar initiatives already exist? For example, in Europe? Do you know?
Audubon doesn't plan for now to expand the Christmas bird count away from the Western Hemisphere, like I said, with the exception of the islands in the South Pacific. The whole data, the value of the data set is its longevity. And if we started imposing Christmas bird count rules on the way people are collecting data in Europe and Asia and Africa and Australia, it would take a long time to start to be able to make any sense out of the trend or, range shifting area, that kind of stuff. There are plenty of other things, and now especially eBird worldwide, where people can enter their historical data into eBird. So it's not just from the creation point forward in whatever it was, 2003, I think it was, when eBird was first actually released. But people that had all their, shoeboxes full of bird records can actually enter their historical data into eBird. So we actually, that becomes a much more useful tool, especially as more and more people are entering their historical data. So with these new data sets like eBird and iNaturalist and other things in other areas that are global, we don't, for now anyway, see the need to expand the Christmas bird count into other areas. What we want to do, the exception of that being, we do definitely want to try to get more coverage in South America, but keep it to the Americas as much, at least for now.
And do you know if there is other initiatives like the CBC in Europe?
I don't know.
Okay.
I know there are programs in the UK, and I think there are programs in Germany and Australia and India. India's there's an incredibly active and avid birding community in India. We see that in the Great Backyard Bird Count. After the United States and Canada, the most checklists come in from India. So it's really, wouldn't surprise me if there are other programs like the Christmas bird count or the breeding bird survey that are being done in other areas, but I unfortunately am not up on the exactly what's happening.
Yeah, thank you. There's one more. Do you share the impact of the data and how it's used by researchers with the volunteer birders who take part in the CBC? And does this encourage more people to take part?
I make every effort to thank everybody that participates on, or especially the compilers that organize the Christmas bird counts, because without them, we wouldn't have the program. But yes, whenever I'm giving talks like this one to a lot, I do speak frequently to local bird clubs and Audubon chapters or at meetings. And I always highlight, it's really almost the most, well, it's a two-pronged thing. It's the joy and tradition of, seeing your friends and your birds and getting to know your area on the Christmas bird count, but it is contributing to a very significant and important database. And there are a lot of people that don't or haven't realized, to the point of your question, that what they're doing really is meaningful and helpful and useful. So yes, I always do, in the results that we just sent out, a lot of my summary talks about, and the regional editor summaries, I'll talk about how how important and valuable the data are that are being collected.
Yeah, thank you. Are there any other questions? Let me see if there's. I have one. And how you become a compiler? Do you need to be a bird expert, or?
Compilers, most compilers, I would say, are very, avid birders and active birders in the area that they want to do their count. Now, interestingly, there are some people who are the bird experts, but they don't want to deal with data entry or actually organizing the count, or doing the data entry, especially can be an impediment to some birders, because our audience tends to be not young. And so there are some counts where the compiler who actually does the data entry isn't necessarily a birder or not an active or long-time birder, but they're entering the data for the one who actually organizes and manages the count. But generally, I think if for new counts that are being proposed, because I get 20, 30 or 40 new count proposals every year, usually it's a birder or a person who's been doing Christmas bird counts in a region, and they move, or they have an area that looks like it could fit in a non-overlapping circle, and they propose that particular area to us to start doing Christmas bird counts.
And you don't provide a training for someone that would like to open a circle, like?
We don't have, we've talked about this, but we don't have online training right now. We do have a lot of resources. There's a whole section of the website called Compiler Resources. And there's a Christmas bird count manual that talks about all the way, the things that need to be done and how to run a Christmas bird count. There's also a separate data entry manual that talks about how to, deal with the data entry stuff. And then we have a whole list of frequently asked questions. So there's a lot of information there for people. But whenever I get a new compiler, I always send them to the link and specific links to different parts of that. But it's up to them to actually explore the resources that are available to them. Many of them know. I think probably the majority of the compilers who are taking over or starting a new count are aware of the CBC and how it's run.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, thank you. There's one more question. Did I read correctly that nocturnal birds are not counted? If so, how comes?
I should have mentioned that nocturnal, what we call owling or nocturnal birding, is an optional activity. Certainly there are a lot of counts, and then we keep track of the number of the hours and miles separate from the regular data for nocturnal birding. But it is an activity that some counts really embrace. And you can so we do have some data from nocturnal birds, owls, and some of the herons and things like that call at night, or rails. But the challenge with nocturnal birding is that many of the species are very hard to detect. So just because people aren't counting them if they spend 2 or 3 hours out at night doesn't mean that they're not there. It just means that they weren't vocal. So it's a subset of the Christmas bird count data, but yes, we do welcome people to do nocturnal birding if they want to.
Nice, thank you. Are there any other questions? I will wait a few seconds to give time for anyone that is still typing or thinking about their questions. I don't see any more questions. So I would like to thank you, Jeff, again for this inspiring lecture, and thank you everyone that attended today. We'll put the feedback form into the chat again. If you could fill up for us, it will be really good. And then also just a reminder that tomorrow at 1 p.m. UK time, we have our fourth and last Christmas lecture of the year, whose title is Development of a Christmas Tradition, Structure, Ecology, and Evolution of Mistletoes. We are looking forward to seeing you there. And then one last thing, the Society celebrates its centenary in 2023, and we invite you to have a look at the events and initiatives planned to celebrate its 100 years. So there is a link in the chat as well if you want to have a look at the initiatives that we have. And Jeff, there are a lot of thanks in the chat saying thank you for the talk, a very interesting talk, and yeah, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure, and thank everybody for showing up. And just as an aside, today actually would have been my mother's 100th birthday.
Oh, okay. Oh.
And my parents were birders. That's how I got into birding, actually. So I've birded for my whole life. So.
Oh, that's awesome.
Just speaking of centenaries.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, so thank you, everyone.